Jen Seals to have some surgery on the 19th of December. Continue to remember Bill Payne and Isabella Guest to have some heart surgery. Michael Clark is with us, and he's still having a lot of back issues, so and I think he's got a procedure coming up. So remember Michael. Teresa Miller. It was mentioned Sunday, Daniel Blackman. This is the 18-month-old that has tumors on the spine. This is a friend of Daniel McCoy's in Auburn. So remember that little boy and their family, because that would have to be an ordeal to go through. Daniel Blackman is his name. This Friday night here at the building at 6 p.m., everyone is invited, but it's going to be a movie night to see the movie King of Kings, and pizza and popcorn will be provided. Just bring sweets and a friend. So this Friday night at 6 here at the building, they're gonna have a movie night, and it's the King of Kings movie about Christ, but everyone's invited. So
that's also the night that the city does the senior dinner.
okay.
For,
Okay. So if you want to swing by the senior dinner, get your dinner, and then come watch a movie, your whole night is planned. I can see Liv's wheels are turning.
She's already planned.
Her whole Friday night is fixed.
I talked to Franklin Allison. You know, we talked about him not having any kidneys before. And they had taken him off the transplant list because something about his insurance. But he said he got it all straightened out.
Oh,
And the last time he was doing dialysis, the doctor came around and said he needed a kidney bad, you know, so they were working on getting him back on the list and getting him some help.
okay. So he's just kind of waiting on it.
So he said, just keep praying.
Okay. Yeah, y'all, most of you know Franklin Allison here in town. He needs a kidney. He's had trouble for a long time now. Our holiday meal is on Friday, December the 12th at 6 p.m. Group 4 is hosting, and I think there's a sign-up sheet on the bulletin board, and church will be providing the meats. Christmas charities gifts are due December the 14th. Remember the holiday schedule change for this month. The week of Christmas, instead of the Wednesday night service on the 24th, we'll have the Monday night midweek Bible study on the 22nd. The following week, we'll have a Monday night midweek Bible study on the 29th instead of the Wednesday. So we'll keep announcing that. And the CYC, if you're interested, there's still some slots, and the Ark Encounter will be planned. It's planned for March 6th and 7th. Does anybody else have anything to talk about or to put on here? If not, George, do you feel like leaving?
Father, we are thankful that our brother Dan before a congregation and presenting things to them that they may or may not want to hear can become difficult. It's time consuming. It's memory. It retains in your memory, and it's very hard to get the things out that you want to say. Father, we are very thankful today. We are thankful for all the teachers around the world. We pray that each one of them teach your word, the true, accurate your word, and do not vary from it. No matter what the age group is, we pray that each one of us will take what it's given to us and use it in our everyday lives. All these things we ask in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you, George. Appreciate it.
Well, if you remember 2 weeks ago, last week we had a devotional, but 2 weeks ago we started talking about one part of this chapter in this book. There's a whole chapter dedicated to what, this is, of course, we're talking about having peace in our lives. It talks about what sin does to us. There's a whole chapter dedicated to it, and there's no way, and I told you I don't want to miss the point of this is important. So there's no way I'm going to do it in just a week or two, and that's fine. But we started talking about the first part of this, talking about what sin does to our peace. So we started talking about why God hates sin. We wanted to identify why God hates sin, first of all, and what sin was. And we talked a little bit about how it is opposite. It is the antithesis of God. Sin is the opposite of Him. Sin can't be attached to Him. He can't, I guess my best word is he can't be amongst sin. He's so pure and holy that it's not something that can dwell in His presence. And that's why the blood of Jesus Christ, that's what it took that to cleanse us. We talked about that a little bit, and we talked about God hates sin for the simple reason that it separates us from Him. And we talked a little bit about, us not being able to, our prayers are not even heard when we separate ourselves from God because we're living in sin. We talked a little bit about David some, and we talked about knowing whether sin is the exception in your life or it's the rule of your life. And there's a distinction there. If sin is the exception in your life, meaning your life is not a habitual sin and you're not focused on sin and you're not trying to live in presumptuous or intentional sin, there are going to be things that we mess up on. But the rule of your life sin, if you have pet sins or sins in your life that you just will not give up, don't fool yourself in saying I'm not living in sin. Don't convince yourself that you're not when you are. And this is part of this I don't want to miss. I don't want to miss the point of us ridding ourselves completely of any kind of presumptuous sin and any kind of things that pull us away from God. Because ultimately, that's not the state we want our lives to end in whenever they do. So, to the next point I wanted to make, I just kind of want to refresh us on where we were. The next point I want to make is God hates sin because it blinds us to the truth. And buddy, we could go a long time talking about this. Think about sin. If you've lived in sin in the past, and probably most of us can say that, yeah, we at one time were habitual sinners. And did you ever convince yourself that, well, what I'm doing is not so bad, or I'll get forgiveness for this later, or well, I didn't mean to do it like that, or any of you ever feel that way? You're kind of just trying to justify yourself, and we did talk about our mind, how in Jeremiah 17:9 says the mind is deceitful, and we can let ourselves be fooled. We can trick ourselves and thinking we're in control, and we're really not. Once you give in to sin, once you give in to the habit of that, who's in control? It's not you. If you're in the habit of it, right? Because you either just want to keep committing it because you want to, or you can't stop. Either way, you're not in control. The Bible tells us you're a slave to sin. So let's look at a couple things here. 1 John 2:11 tells us that the one who hates his brother does not know where he is going, because darkness has blinded him. One simple fact, it says the darkness has blinded him. One thing, this is an example. If you hate your brother, or we have things against each other and live in that way, here's an example where it says you're blinded. You're completely blinded to your sin if you live that way. That's a treacherous state to be in, when we're blinded to our sin of hating someone and we don't even realize it, or we think we're justified in doing it. Another verse I want to pull out before we go to an example here is Numbers 32 and 23, and it's the verse you've heard before, and where it describes it, it says, your sin will find you out. Any of you ever committed sin that you thought, or lived in something that you thought, well, nobody will ever find out? There will be no consequences to this. Nothing will ever happen to me. And lo and behold, you were wrong the whole time. Your sin is going to find you out one way or another. Now, it may not be put on a bulletin board. It may not even be advertised to public. But one way or another, and hopefully next week we'll get to this, but one way or another, your sin is going to display itself, either publicly or to someone, or your life is going to display it. There's no way around that. And if you don't believe me, it's a biblical principle. It says your sin will find you out. David found this out the hard way. Well, he thought he was going to tuck his right under the rug, didn't he? He thought he was going to walk right away, and Uriah was killed, and he was just going to move right on. But that's not how it works, especially if you've become a child of God in your lifetime, especially what we've talked about, how much God cares for our soul. God is going to use that, and this is part of the discipline of God. When he loves people, he disciplines. He may expose it for your own good. And that may be a painful thing, but it's for your own good. So your sin will find you out. So let's talk about this part in a minute. How sin blinds us to the truth. Let's go to Judges chapter 16. You all know this story, but I want to talk about this example here of Samson. Remember Samson's character. Remember how strong he was, and how he was probably a man's man, and he was considered faithful in the Bible. But remember how Samson, God was using him to defeat the Philistines, and how powerful he was, and all the good things that come with that. Well, Samson apparently had some weaknesses, didn't he? So let's start at I'm going to start at verse 4, and this is a little bit long of a reading, but let's talk about Samson and Delilah here. And remember, Samson is a chosen servant of God. He's a chosen. God is using him and his faithfulness to him to defeat the Philistines. So remember, sometimes we may think, because I'm a member of the church, or I'm a Christian, or I'm in control, and this stuff, it can't touch me. Well, let's read this right here, starting at verse 4. Afterward it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah, and the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you. And Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she bound him with them. Now men were lying in wait, staying with her in the room, and she said to him, The Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire. So the secret of his streak was not known. Then Delilah said to Samson, Look, you have mocked me and told me lies. Now please, tell me what you may be bound with. So he said to her, If they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Therefore Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, The Philistines are upon you, Samson. And men were lying in wait, staying in the room, but he broke them off his arms like a thread. Delilah said to Samson, Until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me what you may be bound with. And he said to her, If you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom. So she wove it tightly with the batten of the loom and said to him, The Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the batten and the web from the loom. Then she said to him, How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies. And it came to pass, when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death, that he told her all his heart and said to her, No razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, Come up once more, for he has told me all his heart. So the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hand. Then she lulled him to sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, The Philistines are upon you, Samson. So he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as before at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Let's stop right there. What was Samson's biggest downfall here, besides a woman? What was his biggest downfall? His ego, and it made him tell a secret. You're right. This started back in chapter 14. It started before that, but in chapter 14, he found another woman that he was told that he was not to marry. He was not to marry. Well, in fact, let's go back there. Chapter 14 and verse 3, and you'll hear his attitude. Then his father and mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren or among all my people that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me well. Now, this isn't Delilah. This is another woman. He was not supposed to marry from the Philistines. His ego, his mentality, and his willingness to sin brought him to this point. And he's to a point of not even realizing what he is anymore or what he's even thinking anymore. He's on that slippery slope like we get on that distorts our judgment. Samson was very much there. And in fact, his parents even said, What are you doing? You're not supposed to do this. He said, She pleases me well. In other words, it's all about me. Forget what I'm told. Forget me being obedient. This is all about what I want. Well, previous to him and Delilah, he was also, he was with a prostitute. And that's in a different chapter. That's in the beginning of 16. So all these things were building up as Samson's character. And it's because he has chosen to sin. He's chosen to flirt with sin even. So we gather from this, and this is so important about sin and about knowing what sin is and knowing how much God hates sin. I'm not just telling you not to sin. That's not what I'm telling you. I'm telling you, don't flirt with sin. Don't even allow it within your eyeballs if you can help it, or your grasp, because we are not in control like we think we are, even Christians. We talked about it last time we met. Why did Christ spend so much time in the wilderness, 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, before he went out into his mission? Even Christ had to have training ground for his mind, for himself, not to get on this slippery slope of even conceding a little bit to sin. So I'm not telling you, this is not just saying don't sin. This is telling you, this starts way before the sin happens. Go to James chapter 1, 14 and 15. You know, and we could throw so many examples in here. You know, and we talked a little bit about this last time, but we can slowly inch our way closer to sin and get next to it and think we're okay. And we can also put in our mind that I can handle this or that. And you know, what we're doing may not even be a sinful thing, but we inch closer and closer, and maybe we look at things we shouldn't, and it leads to something else and something else and something else. Well, you know, Jeffrey Dahmer, the killer, the murderer who was put to death, do you know how he said he started with his, he ended up being a cannibal, but he raped and killed and he animals and people, and I mean, he had body parts in his freezer when they found him and all these things. But you know where he said he started? He ended up becoming a Christian before he was murdered in prison. He said he started with just simply looking at girly magazines. He said that's where it all started, just by looking at, and end up being willing to eat body parts. That's a pretty big stretch, isn't it? But the point is, it didn't just start by itself. James chapter 1, 14 and 15, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Verse 14 says, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. It starts way before the sin. When your desires, when you're living in the flesh, even for a moment, your desires can start you on a path to something. And you may say, well, you know, I don't look at things like that, or I don't do things like, I don't. You know, it can become easy to watch things even on TV that are supposed to be clean, or even in just seeing, you know, they're going to put beautiful women in commercials. They're going to put, I mean, to sell their products and stuff, and they may even be fully clothed, but they're going to make them out to something that makes you think. It's intentional marketing. Or ladies, they're going to do something to make you think that you have to be like this when it's a fantasy world. And it's not that, you know, you say, well, I'll never be brought into that. Well, maybe not, but it starts there, and it distorts our thinking. And that's one reason God hates sin so much, because it changes who you are. I've talked to Heather a little bit, off and on. We've talked a little bit, and she told me she don't care if I bring her name up, and I'm not going to. But she told me some things about when she was off not too awful long ago, about the trip she took and some things she made changes in, and I give her a lot of credit. She told me one of the things that and I told her I'm going to bring this up. She told me one of the things that they make you do, one of the first things they make you do, and correct me if I say anything wrong, one of the first things they make you do is, she said, we walk in to this place to recover ourselves, and we have to turn in our cell phone. And she said, I didn't know what to do. I'm paraphrasing, but she said, I didn't know what to do. She said, my whole life was in that phone. And she said, she didn't ever look at anything. She shouldn't be, but she said, I didn't know how addicted just to the phone I was. She said, my whole being was part of that phone. When they took it away, she said, I started realizing you're not even yourself. And she said, imagine being able to talk on the phone once a week. Was it once a week? Once a week. On a regular phone. No cell phone. No cell phone. On a regular phone, and all you could do is receive letters when they let you receive letters. And she said that those letters, she said when it was mail time, and they called it out for mail time, she said that was so meaningful. For anybody that sent her a letter, I mean, you know who you are or whatever, but she said that was just to have that communication. But the point is, we don't know the slopes that we're on with sin, or even, like we read in James, the enticement. I'm not telling you just not to sin. I'm telling you don't let yourself put in a position to be enticed, because it's potentially and probably going to happen if you do it enough. Her talking about that cell phone, and she said that she didn't have access to her kids through that cell phone, which that was communication. She didn't have access to just anything. Anything that she thought was important in her life was tied to this thing. And she said that was the first thing that really changed for her. She said, when I realized I don't have to be addicted to anything, when they took that, the light started to come on, I think you said. I thought that was important because we were talking about 2 weeks ago some of this stuff out here, and she was telling me that, and she said she didn't mind if I bring some of that up. But you know, if you
Well, for me, the anxiety of, like knowing where your kids are at every minute of the day, making sure they safely got to where they're supposed to be. You know, and I think the young kids have that anxiety too, because they have snap maps and things, and they can see where people are, and, you know, their friends, or, you know, they said they were going here and they didn't. Or, you know, so that brings a lot of anxiety in their life. But I realize I'm not in control. When they get in that car, I'm not in control anyway. And that was a lot of mine, is just not being able to constantly check. And I didn't realize how much I did that until I was without a phone for 3 months. And it was the best thing ever, is to have freedom.
exactly.
And everything else is just that total surrender of, Lord, you're in control, not me.
And that is the whole point of sin. When we realize we're not in control and we can turn these things over and realize that we're not a slave to anything anymore. The enticement even of sin. When things don't entice us anymore, and I've said before, and again, I'm not going to even make it through this, but I've said before, I think the older age of our lives are a gift. I think it's a gift if you make it to an older age because of your desires of your body. Fleshly desires start to fade. I think even if you don't look at it as a gift, think about it in that way anyway. Because you start to realize when you can't see anymore, and you can't hear, and you can't. What are you laughing at? You can't stay awake past 8 o'clock anymore, and you carry the grandkid around, it wears you out. All this stuff, once we get older, it's a gift. I mean, if you have your Christianity, if you're a child of God, you have your mentality, and your body is breaking down, I think that's a blessing. I don't always feel like it. I mean, things hurt. Bodies hurt. But it changes from our distorted view, like we realize I don't need this phone all the time. and we got to listen to the warning signs too. God gives us warning signs in our lives about things. And it may be as simple as you go to the doctor for your checkup, and they says, you're at the age you better start eating sweets, or you're at the age you need to walk a little more, or you're at the age of, or drink, you better start drinking more water. You don't need something else, you need water. All these things are warning signs that I think God, not just the physical, but there's warning signs that God gives us that we better be thinking about. Because if you don't acknowledge them and you don't discipline yourself, the warning signs of a phone all the time, we better think about these enticements of sin. Again, I'm not just saying, oh, don't sin no more. Don't sin. I'm telling you to keep yourself from the enticements of sin. And your life will change as far as what's important to you and what's not. And actually, it'll change as to what affects you and what does not. I think it's in Psalms 112. It's one of my favorite Psalms, but it talks about the person who fears God and delights in His commandments. And within that text, it says something to the effect of that person doesn't even fear bad news anymore. How can that possibly be? Nehemiah 8:10 tells those people the joy of, we sing that song, it says the joy of your Lord is your strength. What does that mean? That means you get to a point in your personal life, your maturity, your Christianity, or whatever, that these other things don't necessarily, you realize that's not my joy. Enticements of sin do nothing for me anymore. The joy of knowing God in my salvation is what makes me strong. And that we sing a song that says that. But there's all kind of examples of avoiding sin and enticements and things that enslave us, and how it affects our mind as we can be more holy and reverent towards God. And this is just what Samson could not do. His first mistake was he was arrogant and cocky. He kept letting himself be enticed. He was playing a game here, and Delilah was probably just beautiful. She was probably stunning. And he was toying with her because he was a powerful man, and he had already proven to his parents he was going to go marry who he wanted. He was with a harlot, or tried to get with a harlot. It never says but he tried. The arrogance was just overwhelming. But he was toying with Delilah because he thought he could be in control. But if you'll see the very last little phrase we read there, it said God had departed from him. You think God doesn't separate himself from us when we start to live in sin? The last part I read here in verse 20 said the Lord had departed from him. He thought, I'm still strong. I'm going to go take care of these people who just tricked me. But God had already departed from him. He knew exactly what he was doing, being enticed. He thought he could handle it. It may have even been a big joke to him, I don't know, but he allowed this woman, and if you read the text, you gotta be thinking this guy didn't have any common sense, because 2 or 3 times they'd already tricked him, and there's no way you didn't see through that. They're waiting for you to kill you. They're waiting for you every time you did this. But I think his ego, like David, got so big. He thought, well, what are they going to do to me? Well, when God departed from him, he found out. What happened? What ended up happening to him? He lost his sight. One thing, right? He ended up dying. He asked for one last blessing for God to destroy the Philistines, and he gave it to him. But anyway, the point is, we got to be smart enough to see the warning signs. And when we see warning signs, not to turn away from them. Samson intentionally turned away from his warning signs, slid right down the slope of sin. Does anybody have any comments on that part? I'm quickly running out of time. Go ahead. For what? Say again? But what'd he give it up for? A bowl, they call it the red soup, wasn't it? For a bowl of soup, for the flesh, he gave up his. That brings up a good point. Well, you don't have to answer, but what would you give up physically? What would it take for you in your mind? And until you're tested, you don't know. But in your mind, what would it take physically for you to give up your salvation or the joy of the Lord even? What would it take? Every man's got his price, don't he? Every person has their price. You don't own anything. So if it's a material thing, it's not going to be yours anyway. But what are, he gave his birthright up for some soup. But you may not be giving up your salvation sometimes. But what are we willing to entice ourselves for or sin for? What do we give up sometimes just to potentially do wrong? We give up a lot less than our lives or salvation sometimes to fall into sin, don't we? We give up a lot less than a bowl of soup sometimes, probably. Sometimes it's our pride, our ego. I can't be wrong, so I'm not giving in to this. Or I'm not going to say anything to my workmate who needs some help. I'm not going to say anything about Christ because, well, it may embarrass me or it may embarrass them. We give up a lot sometimes, maybe not intentionally. Don't we give up a lot for less than a bowl of soup sometimes? To me, pride and ego is worth less than a bowl of soup. The wrong kind of pride and ego is worth less than a bowl of soup. But we give into these things, and and we can talk about Samson, how bad of a guy he was. We can talk about Peter and his mistakes, and we can talk about Esau and his, but we do the same thing. We do the same exact thing. I'm not going to finish this week, but anyway, while we're talking about that, Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. This is at the end of my lesson, but I'm going to go ahead and hit it. And you all know what this says.
Ecclesiastes.
12. And two, the point, and like I said too, when we get a little age on us and your body doesn't have those desires to sin anymore, it really is a great thing. It really is. And there's other things that may affect us too. But that doesn't mean you can't be enticed to do. Did you have something, Mike? You can't, and the thing, what you said, I appreciate what you're saying. The things that we're hit with are so subtle too. Heather didn't know. She said she did not know. She admitted she did not know what that cell phone was doing to her. She didn't even know, and tell me if I'm wrong, she didn't even know she was being enticed. And one thing leads to another. You agree? Like you said, without the enticement, without what we read in James chapter 1, without our desires and being enticed, because if you read the rest, it continues to lead on to sin because it leads to other things. But when you allow the enticement, and when we don't understand what we're up against, it's a lot easier to be enticed. Look at Romans 8, chapter 8, within verse 12 and 13, it says, living according to the flesh and you will die. Romans 13 and 14 says, make no provision for the flesh. And of course, Galatians 5, it says, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. We have many warning and examples about flesh and the enticements of our flesh. And Satan is so good at this, and it's so subtle that we don't even realize it. You know, and I'm out of time, but you know that, you may have had a problem or have a problem with something you look at. I'm going to use the men as an example. If it shoe fits to anybody, you just wear it. But with our eyes, and you go to sites or something, and you see things you should not see, or books that you should not be looking at, or thoughts that you should not be thinking. When those are there, and you may say, I'm getting rid of those. But you know what that does to you when you actually see a normal person, a normal female, with clothes on and dressed? When you get to that mentality, and this is what we're going to talk about in a week or two, what this does to you. When you get to that mentality of you're already past that point and you got to get yourself out of it. When you get to that mentality, you can't even look at a female with regular clothes on without thoughts, without wondering things. When you get to that point, that's what this stuff does to you. And it's not just sex and lust and those type things. It can be a lot. It can be greed for money. Once you get to a certain point, you talked about Esau and Jacob. How bad was Laban? You remember that? He was so bad, he kept defrauding his nephew. And we'll get to some of that too. The point is, it all starts with enticement. God hates sin because it blinds us to the truth and it distorts our judgment. I'm going to stop right there, and we'll pick up next week. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to talk about God hates sin because it enslaves us and how it affects others. And we're going to talk a little about David and his whole family, what it did to them next week. But I'm not through. The invitation will be Ecclesiastes chapter 12. I'll end it there.